Hey everyone, welcome to our Draw My Life video for Mary Shelley, the Shellers.
By Rebecca, Zainab and Lena.
So on the 30th of August 1797, baby Mary was born to philosopher William Godwin and feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the writer of A Vindication of Women's Rights. Sadly, 10 days later, Mary Wollstonecraft died of fever and birth complications.
This was first of many tragedies, building up to Frankenstein. Moving on to William Godwin.
Now that Mary Wollstonecraft had died, William was looking after her daughter Fanny from a previous marriage and Mary, but more on them later. William wanted a masculine education for the very intelligent Mary, who he loves very much. As a philosopher, William was obsessed with the concept of physical immortality, and this may have been an influencing factor in Mary Shelley's coming up with the concepts of animation and reanimation in Frankenstein.
What is physical immortality? A state of life which allows a person to avoid death and maintain conscious thought. Her father took a similar interest to Dr. Frankenstein in such subjects.
Whoops, spelling! So in 1801, William Godwin fell in love with his neighbour, Mary Jane Clermont. Clermont had already had 2 children from a previous marriage, who were Charles and Claire. People were disappointed that Godwin chose to go from a woman so great as Mary Wollstonecraft to a woman so average as Mary Jane. She was referred to by journalists as vulgar and worldly woman, who was thoroughly feminine and rather inclined to boast of her total ignorance towards philosophy. So I guess it was a bad choice to marry a philosopher. But hey ho.
In the December of 1801, 4 years after Mary Wollstonecraft had died, William put the question to Mary Jane Clermont.
And she said yes! The sisters Mary and Fanny experienced a very unstable home life, and it soon became evident that Mary Jane preferred her own children to them, leaving them feeling excluded, much like the monster at various points in Frankenstein. Having said this, Fanny soon learnt to deal with her stepmother, whereas Mary could not, and they had a very tense relationship. Mary had even said at one point that she felt disgust whenever she mentioned her.
While Mary Jane felt it was important for Claire to receive a formal education, she saw no such need for Mary, who took pleasure in reading her father's books and writing her own stories.
Meanwhile, things weren't looking too great for Fanny, having always been second best to Mary in their father's eyes, and now hating her stepmother, and also having her relationship with Mary fall apart in a big argument before she commits suicide, which is pretty sad.
In the summer of 1812, Mary was sent to spend the holidays at her father's friend's home, the Baxters. Similar to the creature and the Lacey family, this was her first experience of domestic tranquility.
So since Mary was 14, Percy Shelley had been a frequent visitor at the Godwin household, seeing as he was a student of Mary's father. And when Mary was 16, that was when the magic happened.
Percy was married at the time to a woman called Harriet, but he couldn't help but declare his love for Mary, leaving a very pregnant Harriet behind as they eloped to France with Mary's stepsister Claire.
Who ends up with Lord Byron, by the way. So whilst on their lovely trip in France, Mary became pregnant with herself and Percy's first baby, a little girl who they called Clara, who very sadly died just 12 days later. This was clearly devastating for the both of them. But in the meantime,
Depressed, Harriet committed suicide in 1816, leaving herself and Percy's 2 children behind, although him and Mary were never able to gain custody.
great news was this meant he had the ex out the way, which meant that him and Mary could now get married.
Wedding bells!
However, the general public reaction to this was outrage, and the pair of them faced many trials. The first of these trials was Mary's father cutting them off completely when he'd found out about their marriage. Frankenstein in many ways explores relationships between parent and child and the idea of parents shaping the child's future. They also faced social isolation, debt, and rumours of an unfaithful Percy. Then came the famous summer in Switzerland of ghost stories with Lord Byron, John William Polidori, and Claire.
2 years later, aged just 20, Mary's Frankenstein was published. She had previously only devoted herself to publishing the works of her husband.
However, sadly, the happiness didn't last for very long, and the next few years of Mary Shelley's life were plagued by disaster. In 1816, their baby boy William was born, who died sadly 3 years later of cholera. In 1822, the following year, her husband Percy Shelley was sailing in Italy with a friend and sadly drowned and died. And to top it all off, their best friend Lord Byron died 2 years after that, and she was left lonely and depressed. This loneliness is also a common theme throughout Frankenstein, as the monster is desperate for a companion and some kind of companionship.
In 1819, Mary gave birth to a boy who she called Percy in memory of his father. This was her only surviving child, and she spent her last years caring for him, having been left a widow at age 24.
Diagnosed with a brain tumour in 1851, Mary Shelley died aged 53 in London. She is buried at St. Peter's Church in Bournemouth with her parents, husband, and son.
Thank you for watching!